Welcome to our regulars, and even if you're a first timer here tonight, welcome to you. My name is Alan Friedman. I'm Vice President of the Australian Jewish Association, and I am the MC for this evening. Also visible on your screens are David Adler, President of the AJA, as well as our guest for tonight, Mark Latham, who we will introduce formally in a moment. As you will have seen, the topics for discussion are cultural Marxism, political correctness, and we're going to ask the question, are our political and social values under attack? Now, the format is as usual. David will chat with Mark for about 30 minutes, at which point we will open up for questions from the audience. Now, the way to do that is to click on participants down the bottom. There's a little icon which says raise hand. And if you click that, I will get a message that you want to ask a question, and then we put you in the queue for all the questions. So, and I've already got a couple of people in line. The Honourable Mark Latham MLC is the New South Wales leader of Pauline Hanson's One Nation. He has had extensive experience in politics and as a commentator, notable as former leader of the Australian Labor Party and as a columnist for the Australian Financial Review and Daily Telegraph. And Mark is the original Sky News outsider. Mark studied economics at Sydney University, winning the J.K. Galbraith Prize for Political Economy in 1980 and graduating with honours with an honours degree in 1982. Mark is a popular media guest and is known for his no-nonsense, call it as he sees it views. He strongly opposes the impact of political correctness and identity politics on public debate, freely speaking his mind on a range of issues including energy and criticising obsessive Greens policy, declining standards of education and woke gender fluidity. Mark, welcome to the AJA. It's great to have you with us.
Thanks very much, Alan. Thanks for the invitation from David, and I look forward to the discussion tonight very much. You know, we're in a pretty active news cycle and there's many topical things to talk about, so thanks for the opportunity.
Okay, I'll hand over to David and he can get the discussion going, and I'll try and find a way to cut the noise out.
Okay, well, Mark, great to have you for the event this evening. It occurred to me today that you might be the only person who has led a major party, left politics, and then returned in another party. And to compare Labor with One Nation, some people would regard them as almost polar opposites. So how have you returned to public life, and can you comment on the transition from Labor to One Nation?
Well, it depends which Australian Labor Party you're talking about. If it's the Labor Party from the 1980s, it's very similar to the policies I'm articulating now in the New South Wales Parliament. The problem is that Labor today is unrecognisable from when I entered the federal parliament in 1994. Just to give you one example, their detachment from working class values. Today, their national conference made a decision that people have got the choice of which gender they identify with, that people can openly decide whether they're male or female, regardless of biological reality. So this is Labor's embrace of the postmodernist theory of social construction, that everything we know about ourselves, including our gender, which is pretty clear from the moment we're first born, to embrace this gender fluidity agenda. And one would assume a future federal Labor government, if they got back in, would put this right through the federal bureaucracy, encourage it in the school system, universities, all aspects of the forms we fill out, the identity creations that we have through government agencies. So, you know, that's one example where, you know, when I joined the Labor Party in Green Valley, a public housing estate in southwest Sydney in the late 1970s, if I'd said, oh, look, you know, what our party's going to believe in is that you might have been born male, but you can be a woman. And it's your choice. It's your choice to be a woman. Or for the women at the meeting, you can be a man. It's your choice. If you feel masculine, then that's the way you can identify. It's only a feeling. Biological science goes out the window. And it's a feeling that can change almost on a daily basis if you choose. So that detachment from working class realities, from scientific reality, is manifest. And then you come to the economic agenda, where the National Conference of the Labor Party today said that they wouldn't be supporting new gas projects. Gas is essential in Australia for manufacturing. The gas peaking plants are essential if you want to keep the lights on off a base of renewables, which is another aspect of Labor policy. So whether you're talking jobs and economic reality or detachment from working class values, Labor is totally different to the party I knew in the 1980s and 90s and the party I led in 2004. So I don't feel like my politics is anything but an expression of probably the best period of Labor government in the 1980s. I was speaking to a senior cabinet minister from that period the other day, actually, who's very happy with the things I'm saying publicly, because he sees it as consistent with the true Labor tradition. So I think it's a shame that Labor's embraced postmodernism, gender fluidity, cancel culture, political correctness, the climate agenda at the expense of working class jobs, and now effectively sees blue collar workers as dispensable. They can be chucked onto the unemployment scrap heap at any time.
Mark, I think it's fair to say that if Labor has shifted, so has the coalition, particularly the Liberal Party. And I've heard it said, I don't know if you'd agree with this characterisation, that with the shift to the left of the Liberal Party, the embracement of Greens policies and support for same-sex marriage, etc., that One Nation has actually emerged as taking the conservative space in politics. Is that a fair characterisation or oversimplification?
Oh no, there's very little conservatism left inside the New South Wales Liberal Party. One way of judging the values of today's Liberal Party is how do they run the New South Wales Public Service, which is full of LGBTI staff committees, reconciliation committees, a book club studying Bruce Pascoe, harmony councils, woke committees, Mardi Gras flag raisings. You know, I say of the fellow running the planning department, he's got so many of these woke committees that he's established and he's part of, including just recently a shadow leadership team to project values of so-called diversity. This guy barely have any time to do his day job. So under the guidance of Gladys Berejiklian, departments like the Treasury have become woke political units with very little economic work going on. The planning department is more interested in Indigenous issues, gender equality than actual planning outcomes for the people of New South Wales. And some of this stuff is as wacky as you'll get. And then you come to their jobs agenda again today in the media cycle. Their new climate czar, Malcolm Turnbull, appointed just earlier this week. Malcolm's made his first foray into the media describing what he thinks climate and energy policy should be in New South Wales, where he said that coal mines in the Hunter Valley are on their way out. He said that they have no future, that certainly no new coal mine should ever be approved in New South Wales. Now, this is on the same day we have a by-election in the seat of Upper Hunter, where I'm sure the traditional National Party voters aren't very happy they ever landed with Michael Johnson. But in terms of their economic future, Malcolm Turnbull is even worse, because there are 75,000 coal-reliant jobs in the Hunter. And in local government areas like Singleton and Muswellbrook, 3 out of every 5 homes rely on coal for their income, for putting food on the table, for educating their children. So here's Turnbull, freshly appointed by the National Party, by Gladys Berejiklian, and basically saying all those people can go out of work, and the arrogance and elitism of Turnbull coming from his harbourside mansion to say their future, this is what he actually said, their future is in horse breeding and wine growing. Now, the elitism is just breathtaking. But this is today's Liberal Party, detached from any sense of working type blue collar values, but certainly detached from any commitment to saving blue collar jobs in New South Wales and rendering the Hunter Valley under Turnbull an economic wasteland. So, David, these are big cultural, economic and political shifts in policy and values by the major political parties. So It's a time of rapid change in politics, and I suppose part of my job is to explain to people what's going on so they can get a comprehension of just how bad these major parties have become.
Mark, seeing you raised Malcolm Turnbull, it's been reported in the press a few times that he and his son in particular are highly invested in renewable energy companies. If those reports are correct, then isn't this appointment a massive conflict of interest?
Well, there are conflict of interest rules in New South Wales, and I'll be asking questions in Parliament as to the obvious potential conflicts for Turnbull with those family renewable energy investments. Has he divested those? Has he declared a conflict of interest? How can you appoint someone in charge of climate and energy policy who has major investments, family investments in that space? So either he's declared what is an obvious and would be a permanent conflict of interest, or he's had to divest. I'll be asking those questions because they need to be asked. But also, you go to that article in the Guardian newspaper today, they point out he's got this family farm and large land holding in the Hunter Valley, where he's complaining about the coal mines polluting the air and leaving cavernous holes in the ground and spoiling his view up there. So there's a financial interest as well that seems to drive his attitude about eliminating coal jobs. And you also come to the fact that his daughter, Daisy Turnbull, is on the Strategic Council of the Blueprint Institute, run by Michael Photius and others as a promotion of renewable energy. So there is, unfortunately, in New South Wales around Photius, Turnbull and Matt Keane, a policy-making cartel that unless you're linked to this Blueprint Institute in some way, you don't get a look in for the making of energy policy. And of course, they've gone down the path, I think a very foolish path that'll lead to blackouts of 100% renewable energy in New South Wales over the next decade.
On the matter of gender fluidity and such, there was a motion moved in the federal parliament, in the Senate, by One Nation Senator Malcolm Roberts, and basically to say that the federal government should use the traditional terms and not adopt these new woke classifications, chest feeding and all sorts of other things. Is there a possibility that you or your colleague could introduce a similar motion in New South Wales?
Yeah, I have. I've got it on the notice paper for the upper house, basically saying that there are forms of language that are traditional, useful, integral to our society, like a husband and wife, uncle and auntie, grandfather and grandmother, a boy and girl, that the woke left would like to ban, but they need to be maintained in government literature, websites, government agencies. And most importantly, Malcolm Roberts has moved this, and I've read the reports on it, in response to a doctor in the south of Brisbane, who, this is a very alarming report, had some school students in his surgery and ran them through some tests. I assume these were cognitive tests, and they involved identifying boys and girls on a screen. And the students became very anxious and distressed at having to say that's a boy and that's a girl. And the doctor points out that there's something sick in our society when young people are in a lather, a state of distress about having to say the words boy and girl for identifying clearly pictures of boys and girls. So it's not just the use of language, it's the distress it's causing to young people, because this nonsense has crept into our school system where so-called degendered language and degendered pronouns are becoming more popular, certainly in the university system, and it's creeping into our high schools.
This is really important, what's happening in the classrooms. I mean, it's one of the foundations of our Judeo-Christian ethics, the family units, the basis of our civilization. And if you start white-handing all the identifications, I don't know where it goes. I do want to ask you about a problematic issue that has been, when we invited you, Mark, we had a few people who unsubscribed because they say, oh, One Nation is racist, etc., and how can you invite a representative of One Nation. Now, I first came across something you did, which blows out of the water any allegation about racism or anti-Semitism in particular. And you had on Facebook a large supporters group that had something like 40 or 50,000 people in it. Can you briefly tell the story of what happened to that group?
Yeah, that Mark Latham's Outsiders Supporters Group was hacked by anti-Semites out of the United States and put up completely unacceptable material. It had nothing to do with the support group and nothing to do with the history of that website. So I said promptly to the hosts of the website, I'd rather see it closed down than be subject to infiltration by these sorts of anti-Semitic influences in the United States. So that pretty well, thankfully, was the end of the website, the Facebook page as a practical forum. But just coming to your point, when I joined the Australian Labor Party in 1979, not long before that, they did have the White Australia policy. So my timing was good to come into a party that had recently ditched White Australia. And when I joined One Nation in New South Wales, I made it very, very clear that or any suggestion, any historical material that had a racial component had to be dropped from the party platform, policies, and any future thinking. And I've made sure in New South Wales, in our work in the Parliament, our work as a state branch, that we have been as hostile to any form of racism as any party could be. I think we were the only party, one of the few parties, certainly the only minor party that asked New South Wales election that ran an Islamic candidate in one of our seats, and we're open to people of all backgrounds and religious belief. I'm the sponsor of a anti-religious discrimination bill that should be in the news tonight and tomorrow, because the committee report on it is out to say there are very strong recommendations about my bill to go forward. New South Wales is one of only 2 states, along with South Australia, where we don't have religious protections in our Anti-Discrimination Act. So, David, I can only answer suspicions and concerns by my actions. And I think anyone fairly would say on the matter you raised about the Facebook page and my record in the state parliament, my record going back in the federal parliament, that I have been on the side of fundamental freedoms and tolerance in our society, and I'll stay that way. I'm not caving into any woke agenda. I just believe in treating people as I find them, regardless of their race, gender, sexuality, their religion. And as long as people obey the laws of Australia, work hard and make good use of opportunities, I hope they have every success, every possible success, regardless of any of those background characteristics.
Well, I think I'll just summarise the point that I saw, is that you actually walked the walk. You deleted a support group of between 40 and 50,000 people. So you actually had to make some sacrifice to stick by the principle of saying that anti-Semitism is unacceptable. So I think that earns respect. There has been another ALP move in the last 24 hours, and it's one that is of great concern to our community, and I'm sure the members of this organisation, and that is that the Labor Party decided in its wisdom that it would unconditionally accept and recognise a state of Palestine. Michael Danby, who until recently was a member of parliament, a delegate at the conference, was prevented from speaking. He was gagged. He wasn't allowed to put an alternate view. So I'd be grateful for your comments, Mark, on what you think of the ALP adopting that policy in the last 24 hours.
Well, they're doubly condemned. Condemned for gagging Michael Danby, who you would have thought had every right to express his point of view and try and persuade people. At a conference debate, it sounds like cancel culture at a Labor Party conference. A party that was once of free speech is now shutting people up because they don't like the viewpoint that's being expressed. And the second condemnation is that it's a worrying thing for Australia that we could be ever party to recognising a state that has very clear terrorist connections to the point itself of being a quasi-terrorist state. And I oppose this as strongly as I can, as I did when I was in the Labor Party. I've always been a supporter of the State of Israel. A lot of it is to do with the Judeo-Christian traditions that you mentioned earlier on, which are at the very core of our civilization. We should have a clear affinity with Israel on all occasions, and as a nation, we should not go down the pathway of recognising Palestine in anywhere near its current form and the links it has to registered, recognised terrorist organisations.
Well, I'm going to just take 10 seconds to show a graphic that summarises our view on the screen share. And we've started to put that around our social media. And it's basically a summary of what you've just said, that in order to get to the point of recognising what is a state of Palestine, inverted commas, you have to be comfortable with appeasing corruption, Islamic jihad, terrorism, the pay-for-slay program, Nazi-style propaganda. There's so many reasons, and I'll make a prediction that in the next week or so, you'll see another article from me on this subject, expanding on those principles. So that's all very helpful. There are some funny things happening in Sydney. There's one. It's more a Sydney Council issue rather than a state issue, but it goes to the principle of looking after public money. Sydney City Council has announced that it's going to plant 700 trees per year in the Greater Sydney area, fine, and has budgeted $5,000 per tree, Mark. Now, I've done a little bit of property development, including landscaping. I offer to do it for half the price. I'll do it for 2.5 instead of 5.
Well, you know, 5,000. What are these gold-plated trees?
Okay.
I have a little history with this. 30 years ago, when I was mayor of Liverpool, part of our challenge as a council was that areas like Green Valley, where I'd grown up, to build the housing estate, they came in, not only levelled all the trees, they stole all the rich topsoil and sold it off to other areas. So we embarked on a tree planting program. I think it was 10 or 20,000 trees that we had planted in an 18-month period. And I expect they would have cost $100 a tree rather than $5,000. I mean, this is just off the radar. And the $100 would have covered the planting of the sapling, a bit of watering, and you know, I still drive through Liverpool today and I see these trees mature and grown and think, well, you know, there's one good thing I did in my time in municipal office. So I don't know where Clovermore gets costings from and tenders. We tendered out and found one of these you know, gardening operations who wanted to scale up and plant many, many thousands of trees, and $5,000 a tree, Dave. We're in the wrong business here, aren't we?
I think maybe Malcolm Turnbull will get onto it soon.
That's what we need. That's his kind of tree.
Yeah. Just finally, before we open up for questions, one of the big themes you've pushed on since you've come into the New South Wales Parliament is what's happening in education, the decline of our educational standards. So is there any prospect of turning it around? Australia seems to be falling more and more behind in international benchmarks, despite the amount of money that we're pouring into education. It's almost an inverse relationship. The more you spend, the worse you get. So what's happening in New South Wales education, Mark?
Well, I chair the Upper House Committee on Education, and we did produce a very influential report 12 months ago, the recommendations of which the government has adopted in many areas, which is gratifying. But, you know, I can summarise this, that there's two problems. There's obviously the political content that's crept into schools, left-wing propaganda, notions like gender fluidity, the ideology of transgenderism. It's a problem in its own right. But in terms of academic results, the paradox in the modern school system is that over the years, we know clearly what works in the classroom. We know that direct instruction, explicit instruction of students, the teachers standing at the front being teachers, works a lot better than teachers as facilitators or project-based learning and group learning type environment. So, you know, we know across a range of disciplines, the things that work in schools, all been tested, measured, analysed around the world. John Hattie, a wonderful Australian researcher and resource for the future of our schools, has systemised these things, you know, hundreds of things you can try in a school, and he's got an effect level for the positive outcome on student learning. So, you know, my role's been to argue a couple of things. One, that instead of fad experimental programs, left-wing faddery in our schools, we need to just stick to the evidence base. Unless you can prove that it has a positive effect level on student outcomes, don't do it. Don't run experiments, turn students into guinea pigs in schools. Just do the things that are known to work and get positive outcomes. So focus on student outcomes, measure results, hold schools and school leaders accountable for those results, and stick to the evidence base. So incredibly, in the era of Adrian Piccoli, the former National Party Education Minister, and even Rob Stokes, these things weren't being attended to. We were effectively an experimental system in New South Wales, and the experiment was failing. But I can report that the current Minister, Sarah Mitchell, is a lot better. She does have a strong commitment to the evidence base, and she's introduced, for instance, the Year 1 phonics check, which ends the reading wars and declares quite properly that synthetic phonics is the best form of early literacy rather than whole word. So, you know, the work that I've produced in collaboration with John Hattie has had a positive impact in New South Wales, but it's a big system. The problems have been chronic. It's like turning the Queen Mary on a 5-cent piece. It's not going to happen straight away, but thankfully some of these directions have improved.
There's been a specific program that you commented on with, I think it was with Peter Credlin today, and Bella Debrera of the IPA has written on, which is almost like teaching, you know, critical race theory and anti-white privilege stuff in the schools. So let's finish that segment just with, you know, your view of that program.
Well, yeah, it's indicative of the irrational, you know, unnecessary left-wing political content that's crept into schools. The New South Wales Department of Education hosts a website, anti-racism, supposedly, but you go into the detail of it, and it's teaching children to be critical of the Australian flag, the Australian national anthem, to depict Australia as a terribly racist nation. Well, I don't know how picking on the anthem and the flag is going to is any form of anti-racism education. It's political indoctrination. And then you go into the rest of it, and all the confusing, irrational, unproven left theories are there: unconscious bias, the notion of white privilege, the postmodernism. The other one that's in there is teaching students to that race itself is a social construction. You know, what does a 13 or 14-year-old say when they go and they're taught material that race, the way you're born effectively, is socially constructed, that an Indigenous student might not really be Indigenous from an Anglo background. You might be something else. From an Asian background, you might be something else. You've been socially constructed to think that you are these things. This is incredibly confusing. It's an anti-educational doctrine, this kind of material that confuses students and gets them to think that some things in the world, observable truths, scientific realities, are not true. It's all been some sort of weird conspiracy to con everyone. So, you know, this website is just dreadful. There are some people in the Department of Education who are dreadful, and they promote this kind of stuff along with gender fluidity guides. And I wish the Minister would clean them out. It would be a stronger system if she did.
Yeah. Okay, well, that's taken us to our first half. Alan, if you'd like to come back and invite some questions. You there, Alan? If not, I'll have to do it.
How's the noise level?
Okay, you're back. Right, great.
Yeah. How's the noise level?
That's fine, no problem.
Good, okay. Right, we've got some questions. I've already got some people in line. I've got Sue, Guy, Rachel, Robert, Debbie, Leon and Saul. But just one from me, Mark, before we go to the audience. A guest on the Kenny report this afternoon made the interesting observation that instead of the facts informing the agenda, these days it's the agenda that informs the facts. And I'm just wondering, can we be optimistic that this upside down world will correct itself sometime soon?
Well, only if people of good faith and good rationality fight back. Whatever agenda is informing things, it's not producing facts. There's a whole range of areas where there's an attempt to rewrite our history, to rewrite the meaning of personal identity, things like gender. These are not rational, logical things to do. They offer an unproven radical political theory of postmodernism, and really, what's going on is an attempt to wind back the gains of our Western civilization, the 18th century Enlightenment in particular, when we thought that we all had a conscious, rational, logical way of attending to the benefits of scientific advances, material gains, a better, stronger, more cohesive society, that there was a thing called observable truth in our life. Or the movement really of cultural Marxism is to say two things. One, the economic Marxist project fell apart with the fall of the Berlin Wall, so they've moved on to social and cultural influences. And the second is that it's a very insidious thing to combat, because it's taking young people in particular, giving them confusing agendas to basically say, have you got any problems, anxieties in your life? Well, these are the things that have caused it, and you've been conned and led down the garden path by the system. So it's an insidious movement. It's hard to combat, but people of good faith who believe in, the benefits of all those things we've mentioned tonight, Judeo-Christian traditions, Western civilization, the Enlightenment, the Age of Reason, we've got to stand up against the attempt of the postmodernists to wipe all of those things and replace it with a very barren and concerning landscape.
Yes. Okay, it's over to the audience. I will just remind people, please try and keep your questions as brief as you can. Sue, you're up first, so please unmute yourself and then ask your question.
Hello?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes. Hello, Mark.
Hi.
I am a retired teacher and busy grandmother. I thank you for your strong leadership in the area of protecting parental rights and the protection of their children, of families. Please update us on how, if I got this correct, your education legislation amendment bill is going. People are saying it is a good template for other states to follow. Nearly 8,000 concerned parents filled in a survey in support of your work. Are you optimistic this bill will succeed in prohibiting gender fluid and ideological activist teaching in New South Wales primary and secondary schools?
Sue, you've somehow muted yourself, but I think we've got the idea of your question. Mark, do you want to say a few words to Sue's question?
Yes, Sue, it's a very good question. The bill is about parental rights, and I brought it in because of a number of alarming examples, case studies, and concerning developments. I suppose the most concerning of them all was that once I got behind the paywall of a New South Wales Teachers Federation so-called professional development course, they were basically saying to the teachers they were instructing, and this is the big union in New South Wales, that safe schools might be banned, but here's all these other ways through wellbeing programs, English, PD, HPE, other mechanisms that you can get around the safe schools ban and teach gender fluidity in other ways. And then at the end of the seminar, they told the teachers, if you find out anything about the gender or sexuality of your students, don't tell their parents, because it's not safe for those children to go home in that environment. The clear inference being that the children were at physical risk of violence if the parents found out what the teachers had found out at the school. Now, we've got to return to the sane, traditional, logical position that parents are the primary educator of their children, especially in areas of moral, social, religious belief and values. And while there are many good teachers in the system, they come and go from classrooms, in and out of schools, and ultimately they are strangers in our life. Parents don't get a 6-week holiday at the end of the year. The parents are there on the weekend at night looking after their children, and 99% of parents love their children, support them, do the right thing. So parental rights have got to be legally entrenched to fight this movement that somehow the teachers have become the parents, and the parents are not to be told basic things about their children. And my bill does 3 important things. It says that parents have got to be consulted by schools at the beginning of the year, what's coming up in the classroom, the curriculum. So no surprises. I get so many parents contacting my office to say their 13-year-old daughter came home from school that day and said, "Oh, Dad, English was gender studies yet again." So no surprises, know what's coming up. Secondly, a legal right to take their children out of classes and courses that don't accord with their family values. And third, the most controversial element, is that gender should be taught, according to biological science, not as a social construct. The idea that the teacher could say to an 8-year-old boy, "You only feel male because you were dressed in blue and they gave you a Tonka truck when you were young," or to a 7, this is happening in our system, or to a 7-year-old girl, "You only feel female because you were dressed in pink and played with a Barbie doll." Your gender has been socially constructed, and you can change it at any time of your choosing. Teachers shouldn't be allowed to say that. Safe schools is banned. These other areas should be prohibited as well. And the Education Minister keeps on saying that gender fluidity is not part of the New South Wales curriculum. Well, we need to enshrine that in law, such as the high level of danger of what's happening in our schools.
Yes, and what about national curriculum?
Well, we run the New South Wales curriculum. It is influenced by the national, but in the current review, New South Wales is more inclined to do its own thing. And thankfully, the Minister is saying gender fluidity is not part of the curriculum. Well, if it's not part of the curriculum, how can it ever be taught in New South Wales schools? Because some teachers and some activists and some transgender ideologues seek to go outside the curriculum and do their own thing. That's why we need a legal prohibition on what they're doing.
Yeah. Okay, thanks, Sue. Guy, it's your turn. Please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Hello?
Yep, fire away. We can hear you loud and clear.
So just 2-part question. So Mark, you mentioned postmodernists a lot. Why don't you just call them what they are, Marxists? Because I think a lot of people would get confused by what postmodernism is. It's quite a deep studied field. But if you could just call straight out Marxist or communist, because that's really what we're dealing with here.
Well, it is a branch of Marxism. There's no doubt about that, and it's evolved out of Marxism. Not all postmodernists, though, regard themselves as Marxists, but I try and concentrate on the most insidious aspect of it, and that is to try and convince people that everything we know about ourselves, our identity, our social relationships, scientific know-how, human history has all been socially constructed. And this is a mutant but influential strain of thinking that's specifically designed to roll back the gains of the age of reason and enlightenment and the gains of our Western civilization. So, I suppose the 2-word descriptor of it is cultural Marxism, but it has other more detailed features, particularly in the education system, that need to be explained at greater length.
So that was just the first little bit, and I've written it down. Do you think that identity politics' end goal is actually to completely atomize Western society to such a point that actually forming constructive hierarchies, as in boss, employee, teacher, student, parent, child, are impossible due to the learned oppressor-oppressed mindset?
Yeah, that's a large part of it. It's a very divisive doctrine that sets white against black, straight against gay, male against female, and we're seeing that debate in full flight in Australia at the moment. So it does. I regard it, and I said this when I was in the Labor Party when identity politics was just cranking up in the 1990s, that Labor would regret the day it ever went down the path of divisive identity politics, because it breaks down all notions of social solidarity. It's a betrayal of the Martin Luther King ethos, the Gough Whitlam ethos, that you should look through and ignore things like race, gender and sexuality. They're not integral to a person's worth and value in a workplace or the community. So it is atomising the individual. Worse than that, it's subdividing the individual's identity into things that, A, what can people do about it? I mean, if you're born into a certain race, a certain gender, that's a largely an innate characteristic that you carry through life. No one wakes up in the morning and thinks I'm starting my day as a black person, a lesbian, or a male. People start their day thinking, well, I'm a worker today, I've got to get to work, I've got kids to care for, I've got to get to school, coach the footy team after school, community involvement, I've got my family to love and provide for this evening, spend some time. So people don't spend their life as a function of identity politics. They've got bigger, more noble things to do of a day. So it takes Labor into and the Greens into a dreadful dead end. Where does it ever take you other than social division and an emphasis not just on the individual, but tiny, almost irrelevant parts of that individual that often conflict with each other? You know, look at the debate now about the women's change rooms in sport and transgender, you know, effectively blokes in skirts playing in female sport and bashing up the women pretty comprehensively. So, you know, identity politics can only divide and then collide. Its worlds collide and it's a dead end.
Okay, we've got Rachel next and then Robert. So Rachel, please unmute yourself.
Okay, thank you very much, Alan. My question is potentially just an easy one that you can, you know, clear up for me, something that's always been a bit of a mystery, and that's to do with voting. I've always liked Pauline Hanson's policies. She had the guts to speak out where millions wouldn't, and I like what you've had to say too, Mark, but I've never wanted to vote for anything but one of the two, you know, for the two big parties, because I'm scared of where preferential votes go to. So can you please clarify to me, at the risk of sounding naive, what does your party do with preferential votes, and or do you actually get to sit in Parliament, represent us, or how does it work?
Well, we don't do anything with preferential votes because the preferences that are allocated are in your hands as a voter. You decide in a federal election how you go 1, 2, 3, 4, the different candidates on the ballot. In a state election, it's optional preferential, so we just normally ask people to vote one for us, which we did 2 years ago. So the preferences in the lower house are in your hands. There was a Senate preference system that was worked out behind the scenes, but one, perhaps the only positive thing Malcolm Turnbull ever did was to change that so that it's the traditional way of the voter determining where their preferences go. You can vote above the line, I think 1 to 6, and they're your preferences that you've determined, and they're distributed according to what you want them to do, not some backroom deal by a so-called preference whisperer.
Okay, thanks, Mark. Robert, please unmute yourself.
Yeah, good evening, Mark. Thanks very much for the presentation.
Thank you.
I'll just give a bit of background to my question before I ask it. I am on the board of a very large synagogue here in Melbourne. In fact, I'm the vice president. A few months ago, I replied to a comment on Facebook, which I put a rather innocuous comment on a topic, and it was picked up by some gay activist here who said that it was homophobic and that I'm a homophobe, outed me all over town. It got back to the board of our synagogue, and the board caved in to this because they felt it was bringing the place into disrepute. So now we've been forced to do a session in diversity and inclusion. So I'm just wondering if you can give me a bit of a heads up on what I'm going to hear at one of these sessions of diversity and inclusion, and also some tools that I can use to push back against what I expect I'm going to hear.
Well, I don't exactly know what you've said on Facebook, but I don't like the idea of dobbers, kind of demented people who sit on social media wanting to monitor everyone else's speech. But at these seminars, you'll probably hear about unconscious bias, that you're a straight white man and who's got voices in the back of your head telling you to do dreadful things, you've lost control of your faculties. This, unfortunately, remarkably, unconscious bias is an unproven, weird theory that's like a medieval superstition, that instead of us being rational, logical, conscious actors and decision makers in life, and each of us make hundreds of decisions every day according to what we know and see and our preferences, there's this theory out there that, and this is sort of the basis of saying working people are racist, misogynist, homophobes, deplorable, that there's things that we've been conditioned subconsciously to believe that drive these forms of bigotry. Now, you know, one thing you should ask at your seminar, if it's unconscious, how does anyone know about it? That's the first point and the first piece of nonsense. But this is a theory now that in recent days Scott Morrison has latched onto and advocated. Gladys Berejiklian has said it. You know, people that you'd think would have a fairly decent IQ are articulating what is like a superstition, that we're not rational, conscious actors in control of our lives. There's all these subconscious, unconscious influences that turn us into bigots. Now, you should ask them if it's unconscious, how do you know about it? And you should point them to the only meaningful study of this in Australia ever conducted, and that was in 2017 by the behavioural economics team in Canberra, that looked at de-identified employment applications in the Australian public service and ran an extensive study. They didn't run the study again because it turned up a result that they didn't expect, and I don't think anyone in Canberra wanted to hear, and that was that in the employment of people in the public service, there was a bias, an active bias towards migrants and Indigenous women overall, and that if there was any group being discriminated against, it was older white men. Now, people didn't believe this, but it was a comprehensive professional study with de-identified applications for jobs. And it just showed that Australia is a tolerant nation. If there are white people on these employment panels, they were giving the Indigenous a better than fair break if they knew who they were. Women and migrants the same. There was no racism. There was no bigotry. There was nothing unconscious in what they were doing. So take with you a copy of the Beta study from the Australia. It was out of the Prime Minister's department, the unit there. It's available on the internet. Take it with you and ask them if the study's correct, which it is. Why the hell is anyone doing the course?
There you go. Okay, thanks, Robert. Saul, your turn, and then Debbie. Saul, are you there?
Yep, right. Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Latham. Can I ask two quick questions? First of all, do you see in education the problem also as relativism, that when it comes to battles and corruption and crime, Macbeth and Hamlet are as good as the Justice League of America? When it comes to life on the land, the farmer wants a wife is as good as Virgil's Georgics. And the other problem that I'd like to put to you, what do you think of corruption in politics now? We were made very aware the other day, Rann, Grasby, Murphy, Askin, what they were like, and is it still there now as well, or remnants of it?
Well, I don't know, but I've got this book here by Clary Breese, Corruption High Places. This is the Lionel Murphy and Neville Rann stuff. I'm a little bit sceptical about it, but I am going to read it over Easter. So I'm on your second subject there with material direct to hand. And on your first point about relativism in the education system. My favourite example, this is in the New South Wales English curriculum, where they describe Bronte's Wuthering Heights in the following terms, if it's to be studied in a high school English class, that this was once known as a rich, well-written book on the richness of human relationships, and it should now be seen through the prism of bourgeois gender discrimination and prejudices. You know, it's just as wacky as you'll ever get. One of the classics of English literature, Wuthering Heights. You know, poor old Kathy never knew she was coming home to a lesson in postmodernism, but that's the way the English curriculum has gone. It's as wacky as.
Yeah. Okay, Debbie, well, I'll just ask people to keep their questions very brief because we're coming up to time. We'll try and get through as many as we can. So, Debbie, please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Okay, hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, hi, Mark. I think you're doing a wonderful job. Two quick questions. First, would One Nation consider becoming a governing party that rather than just keeping the major parties honest? And the second thing is, I heard, but I'm not sure if it's true, that minors can undergo, transgender therapy. Like if they've got gender dysphoria, they can go through the therapy without parental consent, and that parents can go to jail if they object. But I don't know if that's true. Do you know any more about it?
Well, the second matter, isn't this the nature of the gender conversion laws that have been passed in Victoria? Yeah. The answer is yes, worryingly, for what's happened in Victoria. And, you know, in New South Wales, you kind of think, oh, this leftist absurdities in Victoria, someone will try to introduce it in our parliament. I'll be hopefully in the forefront of arguing against it and seeing it defeated.
That's right. Yeah, I think that is happening as you described. James, your turn, and then Leon. James, please unmute yourself. We got James? No, okay. Leon, please unmute yourself and you can ask your question, and we'll see if James comes back.
Yeah, good evening, Mr. Latham. Could I ask you this? Do you think that the shift in both of the major political parties, the shift in the direction of a revolution in values, has that been driven by their perception that this is what the electorate wants, or are they leading this march to oblivion? Second question, please. If an Australian Labor Party government were to so-called recognise a so-called Palestinian state, can you think of any Australian national interest that would be served by this?
Oh, well, no, in answer to your second point, it would be very problematic indeed for our international reputation and standing with allies like the United States. I think that's obvious. On your first point as to where these influences have come from inside political parties, it is an interesting question. I think one of the drivers of the identity politics in particular, and perhaps the agenda associated with it, is that some people have come into politics specifically for the reason of their own identity grievances. They've come in claiming a prejudice against them when they were younger, and they've come in to correct that. And I find that, particularly from a leftist centre perspective, completely unappealing, because why would you ever go into politics for things about yourself? And your political doctrine becomes incredibly self-indulgent and selfish. It's all just about you. And, you know, there's sort of a cohort of, I call them the gay left in New South Wales politics, a cross-party divide, and their politics is all just about their issues. Personally, isn't the point of public service to reach out and help other people beyond your own personal circumstances? So I think that's part of it. People have come into politics with identity grievances of their own. You hear that in some of the gender debate as well. And the other factor seems to be that modern political parties have lost contact with people who are genuinely disadvantaged. And a lot of it now is the virtue signalling of the feel-good factor, that they believe in notions of diversity and inclusion and all the virtue signalling that comes with it. As a feel-good factor, it plays well at eastern suburbs dinner parties where people can say they're wonderfully virtuous, even though they're doing nothing to actually help the disadvantaged. So I think, again, that's sort of an individual desire to be seen, to be caring about people, even though in public life they do nothing about it. So these are weird tendencies that have departed from the tradition of public service, which is you help the needy, you help the disadvantaged, and you make selfless sacrifices as a politician towards those ends, regardless of your own individual circumstances.
Thank you. Yes, okay, Marika and Barry, we'll try and fit Barry in, but I think that might just about be it. So Marika, please unmute yourself as you have, ask your question.
Yeah, hi Alan, thanks. Hi Mark, I feel like a bit of a groupie this week, joining you the second time. But after 5 years of fighting on the front line, I've been cancelled really. I've had to remove myself. I'm under another legal case. Looks like it'll go nowhere, but of course it's a process. My question is around, I'm trying to find a political home. Being in Victoria, I don't see how, I mean, I know how policy gets into place, and if you don't change who's actually making the policies in that building in Parliament at a state level, you can't change anything. That's actually where the power is. So my question is about around One Nation in Victoria, and if there is an opportunity to gather like-minded people and I guess use the party, which actually much to my surprise, is very much in line with my Judeo-Christian values and not what I perhaps had been indoctrinated to believe. But is there a place for a movement, to gain momentum in One Nation and do similar to what you've done?
Well, we're hoping so. I've been trying to build us up in New South Wales, and I'm not expert on what's happened in Victoria, but you probably need to have a conversation with our National Director, Rod Miles, about joining up and becoming active, because your interests and skills are the sort of person that we're looking for in One Nation to build up around the country. It's hard going as a minor party, but if we don't make these stances of resistance and pushback, then we just cave into the major parties who've gone off in these completely unacceptable directions.
Okay. Last question, I think, for tonight. Barry, please unmute yourself and then ask your question.
Thank you. Thanks, Mark. You certainly are a breath of fresh air on the political landscape. As an old high school principal, I'm very concerned about what's happening in the educational scene. Are there any legal avenues open to parents? Because schools are clearly and blatantly usurping parents' rights, it seems to me. Is there any scope there in the legal, through the courts? Certainly the left are very keen to mount legal challenges. What can parents do? Is there scope for even a class action down the road?
There is some legal scope, and there are some lawyers associated with Christian organisations that are working in this field. But I hope with my parental rights bill that we could put in place a stronger legal platform for parents to assert their rights, and where schools wipe them, if need be, take the legal action. So, it's sort of 50-50 at the moment. There are some capacities for legal action, but they're not as strong as they should be. So, it seems a strange thing, Barry, that in 2021, we've actually got to say parents have got rights. We've always worked on the assumption that parents have got rights that are fundamental human rights in society and perform one of the most magnificent functions in caring and nurturing children, leaving something better in this world. But the fact that parental rights are now so poorly regarded and wiped in the education system is very alarming. So it does need legislation, but there are some provisions that can be acted on now, and I know a few of those cases.
Okay, thanks. Look, we will have to close the discussion at that point. Mark, I want to thank you for joining us this evening. The chat is going crazy. There's obviously a lot of people that are liking what you're saying. and your common sense and traditional values are very much needed in Parliament. So all strength to you, and thanks for joining us this evening.
Yeah, a pleasure. Thanks, Alan. Thanks, David, and to the association. And I wish everyone all the best. And it's been a pleasure to be involved this evening.
David, I'll hand back to you for some closing comments, and then we'll say good night.
Okay, well, thank you again, Mark, for your generous time this evening. When you do introduce your motion on gender terminology, if there's a video, please make it available and we'll put it onto our social media. It's clearly an issue which resonates, and I think you're going to test some of the moral issues of the New South Wales Parliament with that initiative. So the final thing to do is to just tell people what's happening next week. And as I'm sure you all know, Israel has been struggling to form a government. It has had 4 elections in 2 years. If you want a political mess that's worse than Australia, you only need to look at Israel. And we're fortunate next week to have one of the premier commentators and analysts from Israel, Professor Ephraim Inbar, the president of the Jerusalem Institute for Strategy and Security. And he'll provide his analysis on what's happened to Israel politically, the result of the election, and where it might go. And finally, because we're a couple of minutes after time, as we always do, we ask people to support the association. If you're not yet on the email list, you can go to the website jewishassociation.org.au and sign up. Follow us on Facebook, which has the largest Jewish platform in the country. And finally, if you're not yet a member, please join or make a donation. Thank you very much again, Mark, and Alan, we can close.
Yep, thanks, David. And also perhaps just a reminder that if people are members, that they do need to renew their membership when the time arrives. So please keep your eyes open for that. Okay, thanks everyone. Thanks, David, and to Mark again. It's been a great session. We look forward to seeing you all again next Wednesday night. And until then, it's a very good night to you all. Bye for now.